I would like to inform you that this meeting was funded by the Research Grants Council of Hong Kong as part of a fellowship granted to me in order to investigate the prevalence and incidence as well as intervention and various ways of improving the life of individuals with dementia in the Greater Bay Area, which includes regions of southern China such as Guangdong Province, Hong Kong, Macau, and cities including Zhuhai, Shenzhen, and Guangzhou. These areas are amongst the most numerous in China and significantly are a part of an initiative to develop infrastructure for health in the local area. So because in Hong Kong, we have something of an advantage in our excellent medical school and public health systems, we are able to share today with colleagues in mainland China the vision that we have for improving the care and quality of life for individuals diagnosed with dementia in the Greater Bay Area, but also by extension throughout Greater China itself. So I notice we have many speakers who have volunteered to join us from regions of southern China, which is very pleasing. And also our registrations show many individuals coming in from mainland China, as well as virtually every other part of the world. So we currently have near to 400 registrants at the present time. And all of the videos that we record will be available post-conference. And just to inform you, many of our speakers have pre-recorded their presentations, but they will appear for Q&A at the end of that presentation. So please do bear with us and come in just after the presentation ends, be it live or recorded. Today we have one live and all the others are recorded. So once again, thank you so much for your attendance. The Faculty of Education supports our conference today, and we're very grateful to the Dean, Professor Ling Goodwin, and all colleagues at the University of Hong Kong for enabling this conference to go ahead. I am myself situated in central London in Goode Street at the present time, and Teresa, who is the manager of the virtual conference, is in Hong Kong, and Adam, our technical support, is in Shenzhen. We also have the assistance of technical staff in the Faculty of Education, including Murphy, and I'm very grateful to them. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Teresa and to Adam to give a little more information before we commence the first presentation, our opening presentation from Professor Perani.
Okay. A few technical things to cover before we begin. If anyone has a question like that here, please feel free to add your question using the Q&A button located at the bottom of your screen. If for some reason you cannot access this button, I am posting our official conference email in the chat forum. Please feel free to reach out directly through email, and we will ensure that each speaker is given the questions that they are asked. Please specify which speaker the question is for, unless it's obvious. For example, the question is asked during a speaker's talk. Thank you.
Good evening from Hong Kong. We are officially opening the conference Intervention and Prevention of Neurodegenerative Disease, Building Resilience. And we are going to start with the session Brain Maintenance, Culture, Language, Multilingualism, and Literacy. Our first speaker, guest speaker, is Professor Daniela Perani, and Professor Weeks is going to introduce her to the audience. Thank you so much for attending.
Thank you very much, Teresa. It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Perani this morning. It's in fact a great honor because I intended to invite Professor Perani to Hong Kong many, many times in the past 10 years and was not successful because Professor Perani is a very busy person. And of course, lately travel is not possible, but I'm really delighted that finally I reached my own personal goal, which is to have Professor Perani present in our meetings on Alzheimer's disease that have been held in Hong Kong for the last 10 years or so. So formally speaking, Professor Daniela Perani is a neurologist and radiologist and full professor of neuroscience at the Università Vita-Salute San Rafaelle. She is the director of the School of Specialization in Neuropsychology in the same university and chief coordinator of nuclear medicine neurology in the Nuclear Medicine Unit at the Scientific Institute for Research, Hospitalization and Healthcare, Ospedale San Rafaelle. She is the head of unit in the Division of Neuroscience, also at the Ospedale San Rafaelle, and coordinator of several national and international research projects in neurology and neuroscience. Today, she is on full clinical duty, and for that reason, she is appearing after her pre-recorded presentation for Q&A. So please bear with us as there are clearly demands upon Professor Perani's time at the current stage in Milano. So without further ado, please commence Professor Perani's presentation.
Thank you, Brendan, for what you have said, and please go on with my presentation. Good morning, I'm Daniela Perani. I'm going to present you a lecture on brain reserve and cognition, and I will start my presentation in a few seconds. I hope you will see the slide, so I can start. So I will talk about neuroimaging of brain reserve in dementia. Brain reserve is a construct along the lifetime. The brain reserve hypothesis started several years ago by Rotzig, a psychiatrist, who observing the brain of a subject with senile psychosis, senile dementia, he found some dissociation between the status of the brain and their during life performance. So there were, he said, he wrote, there were enough exceptions to make one reject the idea that there could be any simple and direct quantitative relationship between clinical and pathologic changes. A consideration of the person in whom the lesions are occurring may provide a solution of the problem. The person's capacity to compensate for a certain amount of tissue damage become of immediate importance. So these severe cases in comparison to these less severe dementia cases, they have comparable condition. So this subject must have something different. So he had perhaps brain reserve. So what's about cognitive reserve and brain reserve? The concept of brain reserve has been introduced to explain this inter-individual variability of the clinical phenotype due to physiological and pathological brain changes. It refers to the ability to preserve cognitive function in the presence of neuropathology. We have to remember the famous report by Barulli and Stern. So cognitive reserve is related and induced brain reserve. But cognitive reserve is per se related to fundamental processes such as education, occupation, physical activity, and also bilingualism, as we will see. Brain reserve is related to efficiency, brain efficiency, neural compensation, and neuroprotective mechanisms. These are related to a sort of neuroplasticity made by synaptogenesis and better efficiency in the connectomics of the brain. This is a famous schema showing that individuals with high cognitive reserve, for example, high education, or low, for example, low education, they start presenting symptoms at different times. So with comparable AD pathology, for example, this low educated subject will present symptoms before the high educated subjects. And at any level of cognitive performance, AD pathology will be more severe in the individual with higher cognitive reserve. Once cognitive decline begins, it is more rapid in the person with higher, as you can see here from the slope. This is a very interesting study. The Canadian Study of Health and Aging a few years ago, showing a huge amount of subjects, they reduce incidence of dementia, all kinds of dementia, according to the level of education. So less than 6 years, 6, 8, 9, 12, more than 13. You see the reduction of the incidence of dementia in the individual with higher education. So I want to present you important data on what neuroimaging can tell us using functional, structural, and molecular features on aging, pathology, and brain reserve. So, brain aging effects. We know that cerebral glucose metabolism can be reduced during aging, so going down in particular in the associative cortices. So our brain is less good functioning than when we are young. The same is for the structural component. So we lose a lot of neurons, as you can see here from a large amount of subjects that have been studied. You see that there is a reduction of neurons along the life, starting from the 60s, going on to the 80s, 90s. And this most affects the associative cortices. Neuroimaging of brain pathology. What do we know about the pathology? Well, we have 30 years of research that provide us evidence for synaptic destruction in neurodegenerative disease. So glucose metabolism is very important because it's a proxy of synaptic functioning. We need sugar to function. So glucose metabolism is a real important parameter of our brain functioning. FDG PET is a tracer, PET is a methodology, and we can measure resting state cerebral metabolic rate of glucose, which is a proxy for neuronal activity, and it is an index of synaptic function and density. Loss of synaptic activity and density causes a reduction in neuronal energy demand that results in decreased glucose metabolism. And thus, this is a unique tool for capturing the heterogeneous events that contribute to synaptic dysfunction in neurodegenerative disease, such as the proteinotasis, Alzheimer's disease, frontotemporal dementia, Lewy body dementia, and we have the pattern. There are very important methods to quantify the alteration of synaptic activity with glucose metabolism, and you can find several in the literature. I cannot go into detail. We use this method that compare a single subject with a large amount of normal individuals age matched. So at the end, we have the maps of hypometabolism of the brain, which are very easy and important biomarker. So in Alzheimer's disease, we have the typical bilateral temporoparietal hypometabolism. In the variants, such as in posterior cortical atrophy, we have the same, but there is a very huge involvement of the occipital cortex, and this is a very typical marker. You see the publication below if you are interested to go in depth. Logopenic variant, which is an AD variant related to language, has the same pattern, but there is a huge involvement of the left hemisphere. Here you see also some important paper we published. And this is a This is the semantic variant of primary progressive aphasia with an involvement of the left hemisphere. It belongs to the frontotemporal spectrum. And you see, these are all single subjects showing this typical pattern involving the temporal pole and the temporolateral left hemisphere cortex, which is really, really typical of this semantic variant. In the Lewy body dementia, we have this huge reduction of metabolism, frontoparietal, but also occipital. It's very, very important because it has implication for diagnostic criteria. These patterns I show you of hypometabolism, they are present also in the prodromal phase in the subject with mild cognitive impairment. This study included 80 MCI subjects. And you can see from these little pictures the patterns of each of these individuals that when at the follow-up they progress to the dementia represented by a pattern. So it's really, really specific. It's an accurate biomarker, able to provide disease-specific hypometabolism pattern in the prodromal MCI phases. Why I'm saying that? Because how can we cope with this brain aging, loss of neurons, reduction of metabolism when we aged, or when we have brain diseases with this devastating effect on brain functioning? How can we cope? We can cope with brain reserve, brain plasticity, which is experience dependent along the life. the cognitive neuroscience of aging has provided us several evidence for factors that influence brain structure and brain functions against aging and diseases, such as talking about education, life experience, stress, exercise, diet. The genes, of course, are crucial. And brain function and brain structure can change. And this change cognition, so maintain good level of cognition in all the aspects of cognition. There was different hypotheses of the brain reserve. Some of these included the passive model, which is not very much followed today. What is important, and I believe is the most important model, is the active model, which emphasizes the use of brain networks effectively. Brain networks meaning considering white matter, gray matter, and their connectivity. Just few flash to show you that during life, brain can change according to your activity. This is some year ago paper, very interesting, that compare the musicians with non-musicians. And this is the cortical thickness of musicians more than the non-musicians. And you see there are huge areas which are more dense than the areas of the non-musicians. So there is a cortical thickness correlation in musicians and non-musicians. In crucial areas, which include frontal, Broca's area, temporal regions, it's a clear cut evidence of the role of life activity. This is another paper on chess player, and again, these individuals also at a high level, they have different white matter, more dense white matter and more dense gray morphology, and more important, functional connectivity between these regions, which means that something has changed in these individuals in comparison with age-matched non-players. This is an interesting paper by Garcia Penton in Neuroimaging a few years ago, showing that in bilinguals, compared to monolinguals, there is a strengthening of the network, of the subnetwork. One is related to the left hemisphere and involves crucial hubs of the language system. And the other one is another network, which is important for the cognitive control. So the frontal polar, the superior temporal, and the parietal region, again with the strengthening of the connectivity. And this is also evident by these figures here, so global efficiency. And this is a clear demonstration that bilingualism creates some changes in the brain. Here also, the direct addressing of the connectivity show that there is an increase of connectivity in this crucial fiber tracking, in particular the anterior corpus callosum, which connects both hemispheres. And in a global vision, the left hemisphere, frontal, temporal, and parietal are more strength in bilinguals, and also the frontal anterior than in monolinguals. So there are protection factors such as education, occupation, cognitive and physical activity that change the brain. And this is a typical paper I talked you before. It's important in disease, so we are talking about pathology, that along the time course of the disease, which we know today can start years, decades before the full blow of dementia, the increase of amyloid or protein deposition, the increase of neurodegeneration, as we can see from synaptic activity and glucose metabolism, and the cognitive impairment, the origin of the cognitive impairment, there might be a delay, you see, during in the onset of MCI phase due to the presence of cognitive reserve and so brain reserve. High risk individual with low reserve present impairment, cognitive impairment before the low risk individual, and the low risk individual are the individual with high cognitive reserve and so high brain reserve. This is a paper we published a few years ago in neurology, and it's important because we analyze MCI converters and AD dementia patients, Alzheimer's disease dementia patients, considering education and occupation. A large amount of subjects, as you can see, and solve a series of normal controls. The measures for glucose metabolism, brain, years of schooling, occupational level as a proxies of cognitive reserve, and they have a neuropsychological assessment to see the level of cognition. We found a direct linear regression between education and this region that you saw before, profoundly affected by this disease, by Alzheimer's disease. This means that individuals with high education have more devastating hypometabolism than individuals with low. This counterintuitive evidence is the demonstration of brain reserve. This subject had profound arrangement of the brain before starting with cognitive symptoms. The same was for the occupation, the same linear regression with the same region. So the higher level of education and occupation provide brain reserve in individuals with Alzheimer's disease. And the same was true for the mild cognitive impairment in the prodromal phase. So they are the same direct correlation in the parietal cortex and in the precuneus, so was less devastated the brain, but still in these regions we saw this relationship. Occupation and education. This is another study where we study gender differences in healthy aging and Alzheimer's dementia, and we use metabolic activity and resting state network connectivity. And it was again a study on clinical and imaging data on a huge group of subjects, healthy controls, aged and Alzheimer's disease patients. I don't want to go into detail, but you see the age is 17, meaning mental is normal. They have all normal, all normal cognitive functioning, whereas the AD patient, they have the same age, but of course they have absolutely cognitive deficit in the domains that we investigate, the typical Alzheimer's disease dementia patients. What we found a lot of things. Here I want just to show that in healthy elderly group, education and occupation provide brain reserve. But this was different from male and female. Female had more brain reserve in limbic structures, as you can see. So anterior temporal region, hippocampus, amygdala, insula cortex. This medial component received in elderly individuals, female, more brain reserve, whereas males had more reserve in associative parietal cortices, as you can see here. The occupation provides the same evidence, so they are very linked. Sort of education is lead to a typical kind of occupation. The Alzheimer's disease patient, they show comparable evidence. So these are dementia cases which have level of education and occupation which are different. And again, you see that there is brain reserve in female characterized by a more higher level in the medial brain structures, where for male, education and occupation provide more brain reserve in the associative posterior regions. So in Alzheimer's dementia, gender differences were found with increased brain reserve in prefrontal circuits for cognitive control and social-affective networks in females, the limbic structures, and in temporoparietal associative regions in males. This gender difference may be the effect of underlying biological determinants and lifelong socio-demographic factors. What about other dementia conditions? The impact of education, occupation, mild light leisure activity on brain reserve measured in Lewy body dementia and frontotemporal dementia spectrum. We have some evidence about that. I'm going to show our results. And in this study, we apply the connectomics. So the possibility to apply multivariate methods that really has paved the way to the assessment of unexplored cerebral features, such as resting state brain network. Changes in brain network topology reflect the neural responses to damage with key maladaptive processes. So the study of brain metabolic connectivity, as we did, can reveal how cognitive reserve and brain reserve cope with brain dysfunction. neurodegenerative disorder can disrupt molecular pathways, synapses, neuronal subpopulation, and local circuits in specific brain regions, as well as in higher order neural networks. And that's what we investigated in these studies. This is the first one where we study frontotemporal dementia, controlling for the kind of social and cognitive skills in occupation activity. So we went more in depth to the kind of activities for occupation in frontotemporal dementia. To do that, you use the occupational information network, which is really crucial in this sense, because it's a database that contains hundreds of standardized occupation-specific descriptors. And you can choose some descriptor and correlate these to your pathology population, as we did. So we had the framework that identified the most important types of information about work and integrates them into a theoretical and empirical sound system. We found, for example, in frontotemporal dementia, that high occupation level, considering the typical occupation we found with ONET, is directly correlated in our individual with frontolateral cortex. And occupation with the specific kind of occupation we investigated, this is just a summary, overall summary. In particular, the social skills included in the occupation, so that you can have spatial skills, social skill, visual-perceptual skill, there are several, but the social skills were related to, again, this component of the frontal cortex in these individuals. So these results add new evidence to the literature that suggests how real-world social network might contribute to brain structural and functional reorganization of brain regions, classically damaged in the frontotemporal dementia, in particular with the behavioral variant. Thus, jobs requiring high social interaction, attention, and executive skills, as we investigated, might help in promoting the inception of alternative and redundant neural networks to support cognitive function in presence of neurodegenerative processes. This is another work that I'm going to present you on this, again, specific occupational profiles as proxy of cognitive reserve in dementia with Lewy body. We explore the role of occupation, again, and perform regression analysis models and seed-based interregional correlation analysis with brain metabolism and the relevant resting state method and proxies of cognitive reserve education, 6 levels of occupation, and a specific ONET occupational profile. Here you have a more clear explanation of the ONET factors. For example, occupation requiring problem solving, social skill, visual abilities, visual construction abilities, higher or lower. It depends, of course, the level of occupation. And this level, different level of occupation, might affect the brain. And in this Lewy body dementia that you know has a devastating hypometabolism, parietal and occipital, we found that the occupational profile modulated the anterior deformant network, the posterior, the attentional, the executive, and other network connectivity, according to different neuroprotection mechanisms, neural reserve and compensation. So if you go into detail reading the paper, you will see that the higher level of occupation, the type of occupation, correlates with brain reserve, where the low level correlate with a different brain feature. Major difference again in the fundamental resting state network, where an increase of metabolic connectivity with network was observed in Lewy body dementia subgroup with high education compared with the subgroup. And again, a major difference. And the occupation also provide evidence for brain reserve in specific areas and in anterior deformant network with high occupation. So this research provides new contribution to the current literature of cognitive reserve and brain reserve in Lewy body dementia. either by means of brain metabolic connectivity analysis that can best capture experience-based plasticity and by investigating specific occupational profile using the ONET variables. The latter allows including a more comprehensive picture of primordial long-term life experience that may enrich the cognitive resilience. Thus, we suggest that further clinical relevant consideration for the standardized neuropsychological assessment, the premorbic occupation, should be considered as a demographic variable in the scoring phase, generating adjusted score also. This is an interesting paper where we show that plasticity and maybe brain reserve exists also at the level of brain biochemistry, so at the level of neurotransmission. We studied the cholinergic activity using a specific tracer with PET, and we show that there is a devastating loss of cholinergic activity in Alzheimer's dementia, as you can see here from the red blobs. This is a loss of cholinergic activity, and in particular in the hippocampal structure. You know that the cholinergic activity is widely distributed all over the brain. But the most important aspect in this paper by Garibotti and colleagues, we show that there is a direct relationship in our subject on the level of cholinergic activity in the hippocampal structures. So this is a direct, so the higher the level of education or occupation, and the better the functioning of the cholinergic system in these temporomedial structures. So there is, I think, an interesting aspect we need to be further investigated. So imaging brain reserve is a very complex picture. Now I want to pass to the bilingualism, which I think is a very, very important aspect for the social aspect and neuroscience aspect. This is the first fundamental evidence provided by Alladi and co-workers 10 years ago about that show that all kinds of dementia, AD, frontotemporal, vascular, DLB, or mixed dementia, can be delayed or are actually really delayed in bilinguals in compared to monolingual by 5-6 years, which is a long, long time. It's a very important proxy for delaying the onset of dementia. So we studied, as described in this paper, the impact of bilingualism on brain reserve and metabolic connectivity in Alzheimer's dementia. We studied bilinguals, 45, and monolinguals, 30, with same age, with the same disease duration. But as you can see, age was different, even in this small group of subjects, 77 against 71. Plus minus. So it's also in this little group evidence of some difference of age. They were not comparably affected because bilinguals were better in some neuropsychological tasks, in particular on memory. So there was a difference. Bilinguals were better than monolinguals. They were all AD dementia. The metabolism presented in both groups the typical posterior temporoparietal hypometabolism, but in bilinguals were much, much wider. So there was a much large involvement of the left hemisphere that you can appreciate here from these function anatomical slides than the monolingual. And this is a typical brain reserve evidence, as I showed you before. We also calculated the index of bilingualism, so the level of the use of bilingualism along life. And this index was defined the perfect bilingual to the monolingual. And this bilingual index was directly related to a sort of compensation in the frontal regions, where the metabolism was better in the bilingual than in monolingual. And these are spared area, and was, as I showed you before, the inverse correlation for the affected areas. So the bilinguals has more brain reserve in these posterior regions. The resting state network was also affected because the brain connectivity supports the neuroprotective effect of bilingualism by showing increased connectivity in executive control network, default mode networks, where bilinguals have more strength connection than the monolingual. Then this is very interesting. Here is better shown, where you see the increase of strength in the bilingual in comparison to monolingual, more reduced strength of connection, and the overlap, in particular in this control region, retrosplenial cortex, cingulate cortex, caudate nucleus, thalamus, which is very important evidence for better control systems in bilinguals than in monolinguals. So these results indicate a neuroprotective effect of bilingualism, even in the presence of neurodegeneration, such as Alzheimer's disease. These effects are represented by brain reserve, increase in synapses and activity, and in the integrity of white and gray matter, and the neural compensation, so stronger connectivity in circuits crucial to the control of cognitive functions. Bilinguals must keep two languages separate, use a different phonology, lexicon, syntax, and grammar specific to each language, and avoid mixing them. To do so, bilinguals would use the same neural structure that are used in general to make quick decisions, to control other cognitive functions. So the control systems are very well functioning in bilinguals. And bilingualism is a sort of tuning for the brain. I want to show you that this is not the only evidence, because we repeated the experiment. Second study, it's impressed in human brain mapping now, confirmatory results. The aim was again to study the effect on the brain of bilingualism in Alzheimer's dementia cases. And we had 98 subjects, 56 monolingual, 32 bilingual. And this is a new multicentric study where there were not only English, Italian, they were polyglots. So from University of Geneva, from the Südtirol region, and from my center. And we studied FDG PET, baseline metabolism, and metabolic connectivity. And again, we show the same large involvement by hypometabolism in the bilinguals as in the other group we studied before. So we confirm the same results. Bilinguals are more affected in hypometabolism than monolingual, and this is brain reserve. And the bilingual index, so higher the use of the second language, was directly related to the compensation effect in the frontal region. Strong correlation in the left hemisphere in the language system for the bilingual index. There is a strong correlation. So this is an evidence that the higher the bilingualism, the more severe the hypometabolism in this crucial language network. And again, there was a correlation, metabolic connectivity and the resting state network, the executive, the language we investigated this time. So we confirmed the executive, we found the language and the anterior default mode network, where, as you can see from the color in red, the bilingual has more strong and large connectivity in this resting state network than monolinguals. So again, we show brain compensation. And we did another very sophisticated analysis between the resting state activity and the bilingual use, bilingual index, so the use of the L2. And we found a strong correlation also on using the bilingual index in the crucial region of this network. So double and strong evidence for a compensation mechanism. So these results confirm again the neuroprotective effect of bilingualism, even in the presence of neurodegeneration. Of course, these effects are represented by brain reserve and neural compensation. Thus, the last suggestion is learn and use languages, and of course, dialect, to improve the connectivity and the brain status. We summarize myself and my colleague and friend Jubina Bitalevi in this paper on current opinion in neurology, bilingualism, dementia, cognitive and neural reserve. If you're interested, you can go through. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Perani. Many, many congratulations on a fascinating and stimulating talk and also wonderful results. I would like to begin with some questions just for the purpose of making it clearer to the audience that we began by discussing occupation, education, which was very much appreciated. But I'm curious about just explaining to the audience how in your samples, it's not the case that the multilingualism or bilingualism effect could be explained by choice of occupation or level of education. So let's take Genève. So in that sense, there would be a pluralistic linguistic environment in terms of occupation, but also in terms of level of education. And this is similar in Hong Kong, where most people speak at least 2 languages, sometimes more. It's not the case that people with more education will speak more languages, or people with certain occupations will speak more languages. Could you just explain that a little bit in terms of your sample so the audience understands that there's not a correlation necessarily between education, occupation, and bilingualism?
This is a very crucial point that maybe wasn't so much evident in my talk, but these are Neuroimaging variables. If you want to focus on bilingualism, we have to focus exactly on this proxy. And to do that, we control in all our analysis, either of brain metabolism or connectivity, for level of education or occupation, when this is not the focus of the study, so the precise correlation we want to find. So in a sense, we can be confident that a control for these other variables was performed. A difference in the study where we really focus on this proxy education or occupational levels, as we did on ONET occupation differentiation, which was, I think, very, very important. I would suggest to all my colleagues to use this method to specifically try to understand along the life which kind of, different aspects of occupation can affect the brain, which is fascinating, which is really, really so interesting. You see, in the Lewy body dementia, if you read the paper with more time, you will see that the occipital cortex, which is devastated, is more, so there is brain reserve, more devastated in people who had job involving visoperceptual abilities and this kind of aspect, which are very, very well selected in the ONET method. So I think I've answered to your question, Brandon. You are mute.
Can never get that right. So Adam, perhaps you could ask the questions appearing in the Q&A, please, beginning at the first.
Okay. So Professor Weeks, I'm going to forward you the questions, but I will go ahead and read the first one. Let me just go ahead and load this. I apologize, there's a few of them. Okay, so Professor Perani, in your lecture, you presented vast evidence of how experiences such as multilingualism or being a musician or even playing games may change brain structure and functioning. Is it possible that this relationship is in the opposite direction? Because your brain is more efficient, you are more likely to engage in these stimulating activities. So the direction of the effect.
Oh, yes, this is also a very interesting issue, in particular for musicians, for example. And this, I think, has been investigated. So why a person became a good musician and why others don't? Of course, it depends by our brain, I'm pretty sure. So you might have the so-called talent. You are better than others. And of course, this depends by how perhaps strength exists in your connection. How are the modulation of your systems from birth? So it's a sort of maybe also genetically contribution to that. And we have the evidence from that, considering, for example, let's say dyslexia. Dyslexia people, of course, they have problem in reading, depending by the severity of the brain problems. Today we know that dyslexia is related to dysfunction and so to altered structure of the brain induced by specific genes. And for example, these people are have a lot of difficulties in learning languages, in learning different languages, because they have phonological problem mainly. And why they have phonological problem? Because their phonological system is not very well functioning. So there is this sort of, you know, you adapt your choice and your experience also on the basis of what you are going to do at the best. If I cannot learn a language because I have phonological difficulties, for example, for the language such as English and maybe less for Spanish and Italian, which are more transparent, I try not to learn and not to speak. So of course you are right. There is a double side of the medal to be considered, sure.
Thank you so much. I'm going to jump in with chair's privilege because there is a question that's come up, and I think we need to answer this one as a top priority. The question is, why do we have to distinguish cognitive reserve from brain reserve? Cognitive function is the outcome of brain function, isn't it? So you've explained it very well in your presentation, but perhaps you could just reinforce it a little more and unpack it for our guests today.
So in my opinion, so my position as a neurologist mainly, so a neuroscientist, it's so simple. Cognitive reserve is something that you can measure behaviorally, cognitively, making scores and so on. And cognitive reserve increase with experience, increase with a lot of condition, and cognitive reserve is regulated by proxies such as education, leisure activities, playing chess, occupational profiles, and so and so. But of course, this is related to brain, absolutely. So if you have a high cognitive reserve, you couldn't have low brain reserve, for sure, and the opposite. So what you are going to measure with brain reserve, we are going to look at the brain mainly. And so the brain of persons which have high cognitive reserve is different from persons who have low cognitive reserve. In which sense? They have better connectivity, they have more dendrite synapses, they have more volume, and so on and so on. So there are plenty of evidence for brain reserve from a neuroscience standpoint. So this is my opinion. The neural compensation may be a little more articulated difference in the sense that you're going to measure, for example, connectivity. So you can measure in the sparing area, for example, in Alzheimer's disease, you see that in frontal area that are less affected, you may find a sort of compensation with a better functioning of the connectivity in bilingual AD than monolingual AD, for example. So I think I've said what.
Thank you. Sometimes because we're speaking in many different languages across the group today, I would just like to point out, as you already have, but just to reinforce the term neural maintenance, which is a useful way of distinguishing. I think people become confused when we use reserve for both cognitive and brain, but neural maintenance, as you've said very clearly, is a separate concept which is clearly correlated, but it expresses, at least in English, the word maintenance, the ideas that you've presented to us. So thank you so much for that. We have a few more questions on this very same topic, so let me go through them. A colleague has written that their work has shown that verbal IQ, that is passive vocabulary in the native language, can also act as a cognitive reserve proxy. Is there any work on verbal IQ in additional languages as cognitive reserve?
This might be a very important issue. I'm sorry, I'm not aware of such a study. So it's possible. I think that it's a very interesting research question and should have been studied by someone, but I'm not aware of that today. Hi, Thomas. Maybe you know if IQ is language IQ is correlated to cognitive reserve and so on. Do you know any studies about that?
One moment, I have to unmute me first. Yes, I mean, we have done a study, which I will be mentioning just in a few minutes when I will be speaking, looking at the IQ, because of course, one of the big problems is so-called the issue of reverse causality. So is it that people speak many languages because they are simply bright, in which case it is just, the multilingualism is just a correlate, functional correlate of their high intelligence, or is it that learning languages has a positive effect? And we were in a unique situation in Edinburgh because we have the so-called Lothian birth cohort who was tested for their intelligence when they were 11 in 1947. They were all born 36. Tested 47. So in a way, that's a study that otherwise you have to wait 80 years to do. Yes. Because we can now look, and those who have learned another language after age of 11 performed better than you would predict on the basis of IQ. So I think that is in a way quite an interesting study because it's an absolutely unique cohort. Yes. That we can have people who we know exactly how they perform in cognitive functions when they were 11 in 47, who are now in their 80s.
Very interesting.
So I will mention that I have one slide, and thank you very much. I managed to put one reference to your presentation in mine. I was impressed by Rothschild 37. You know that I'm always very much in looking into history, and I was impressed. I have to admit I didn't know, and it's a wonderful paper.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thomas.
Thank you so much.
More questions. We have a couple more questions for Daniela before her precious time runs out. The first question we have is, could more skills in the second language also be an indicator, proxy of IQ? And that comes from Dr. Nielsen, another panelist today.
So I think can you repeat the questions? Because I think it's very similar to the previous one, so I don't see the differences. Can we see difference between bilingual that start to acquire L2 in childhood and bilingual that acquire to after childhood? This is a question.
So perhaps Rune could come in as a panelist and just explain your question in more detail.
Thank you.
Yes, I think Thomas just answered this question very, very well in his introduction to the theme. That was my point was with the reverse causality as well, whether you have taking that into consideration in your studies, because I've only done a single study on this, but I definitely saw that better educated people were also better able to learn second language, specifically migrants in this situation.
Sure, that's for sure. That goes with the brain reserve, with the brain compensation, and whatever, because better educated have, of course, a brain, all this kind of brain proxy, let's call it, maintenance, reserve, compensation higher, because the education, of course, provides different style of life, and so different occupation and so on. So the brain is better equipped, let's say, to cope with aging, neurodegeneration, and to use better and to learn much easier different language. But if you think to the epidemiological evidence by Aladi, she demonstrated that in India, in an area where people is low educated, but they speak to survive several dialects, they have this epidemiological evidence of later incidents of all kinds of dementia. And this is to millions of people, millions. So this is, I think, a very important evidence. We have to go on to study this. And we investigated Alzheimer's disease cases in 3 studies. Malpetti and all, and Perani and all, and the last one I show you, that the brain is different in bilingual, so something should happen. Also in this, they were peasants, people very, very low level of education in that area, as is written in so.
Thank you. We have another question more specifically about logopenic aphasia. The question is, logopenic aphasia is considered an atypical form of AD, and is often associated with a history of learning difficulties, such as developmental dyslexia. Could we imagine that the earlier onset of logopenic PPA compared to Alzheimer's disease relates to patients having more difficulties to build cognitive reserve over their lifespan?
Oh, that's such an important question. I'm so much interested. The editor sent me to review paper on this kind of vulnerability in different diseases. And I really think that it's exactly what happened in the brain of people who has developmental disorders. They have less strong, less perfect functioning of some systems. And in fact, they have deficits that they come out mild, severe, whatever. It depends by how the architecture of the brain has been damaged. And when another neurodegenerative disease sum up to this brain, so the vulnerability present allow the emerging of specific deficit. So as Marcel Mesulam showed and his group show that, for example, logopenic aphasia that became AD, or the other kind of progressive primary aphasia, have in the history high percentage of developmental disorders, in particular dyslexia or whatever. And this is a sort of the fact that two negative things they overlap: the vulnerability, because if you have a system which doesn't work very well along your life, this is a more vulnerable when a neurodegeneration will sum up. And so I think it's present also in other condition, and I've written an editorial for the Green Journal, which will come out easy, because I review one of these important papers that show that even at the young age, when you don't have the disease, there are aspects that can be detected of vulnerability, behavioral, cognitive, and so they exist. And the brain has, of course, problems, otherwise the deficit will not come out.
Thank you. And another question, which I think is quite central and important for the audience, who may not be aware of this work. Can we see a difference in disease between bilinguals who start to acquire L2 in childhood compared to those who acquire L2 after childhood?
So in my opinion, this cutoff point, childhood or after childhood, has very few to do with the history of brain and bilingualism, because it has been shown that the most important variable, the most important parameter that affect bilingualism in the brain is use and exposure. And in fact, the extreme evidence is from adopted children. They are speaking a language and then they are adopted in a completely different country. They completely forgot their language and their brain is occupied by the second language that they learn, and so on. So I don't think there will be difference on this aspect. So age, childhood or after childhood. But it depends by the use of the language. And this is the reason why I address my research on Alzheimer's disease on patients who had a long-lasting bilingualism. So all over their life, the effect is linked to the use, to the long-lasting use. And I measure also the index of use. So how along the life and during the day, these people has use the second language. And this is the index that correlates with the brain reserve and so on. So I don't think the distinction childhood or after childhood will be very effective on the brain correlates. That's my opinion. You are mute, Brandon.
We had a question related to that question about intersentential code switching. Did you measure code switching in your participants?
No, I couldn't do that in my Alzheimer's disease patient because I would have used functional MRI, and these are instead synaptic activity with glucose metabolism in resting condition. But it might be interesting. Why not?
Thank you.
I think it's an important point to be investigated. It's a very special research question. But...
We have an interesting question, and we'll finish at that one. Has anyone looked at older migrants who are bilingual or multilingual but missed the opportunity for education during World War II, as an example?
I don't know, it's an important point to be considered, but I have a series of cases and which I selected, and I don't have this variable measured, so I don't know.
And finally, what do you think are the variables that modify this relationship between education and...
Sorry, Brandon, it was passes a car and I didn't...
So what do you feel are the critical variables, the takeaway for the audience? What are the variables that moderate these relationships between education and dementia? What would you recommend?
Which are the most important variables? I think education and occupation, I show are both important in coping with neurodegeneration. We show in different dementia conditions, not only me, but there are several. There are some researchers consistent with our results, and as well as bilingualism. I think that if you go to test other long-lasting attitude and performance, you will find a correlation. That's the point.
Okay, well, thank you so much. We've come to the end of your hour, and we're very, very grateful for your time and answering the questions in the chat. Thank you to the panelists as well for your questions, and also to the audience members. I think we've fairly addressed all the questions in time, and thank you again. Congratulations. I don't have a function to raise my clap, but thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all, and I'm happy to see, not in presence, but far away friends. It's a long time I don't see. Hi, Brandon. Hi, Tom. Hi, everybody. Hi, Maria Teresa. Thank you for all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.